for those who are preparing for UGC NET in English and TN SET in English. And if you want to study in English literature, you must learn, you must have some basic knowledge of English literature. So you must learn first periods of English literature. So you have the first slide is, so we have Old English period, or we call it Anglo-Saxon period, and Middle English period, the Renaissance, or we call early modern period, Elizabethan age, Jacobean age, Caroline age, Commonwealth period, and the neoclassical period, which means a new classical period. They, because during the time they started to imitate the classical writers, and the restoration period. During this time, Charles II, he has restored his kingdom, so we call the restoration age. So this is the first slide of periods of English literature. And next we shall move on the second slide of periods of English literature, the continuations. You have the Augustan age, or we call the age of Pope, the age of sensibility, or we call age of Johnson, because they started to think, and they put forth new ideas during this period. The Romantic period, most probably we like this age. The Victorian period, of the Victorian age, the pre-Raphaelites, aestheticism and decadence, an Edwardian period, the Georgian period, the modern period, and the postmodernism. So now we are in the trend of postmodernism. And many researchers who are doing research in postmodernism. Okay, so you recall this slide. Then we shall move on. The next slide is chronological order of English writers. So we have here the contemporary of Chaucer. So John Mandeville, John Barber, John Gower, William Langland, Geoffrey Chaucer, Thomas Occleve, John Lydgate, Stephen Haas. So they are the prominent, they are the distinguished, they are the expert to produce the poetry. So they are having the skill of to compose the poems. These are all the writers, and they are the part of contemporary of Chaucer. Okay, and we shall move on the next slide. You have that is university wits, right? So they are they can be divided in two types: Oxford scholars and Cambridge scholars. So who were educated at Oxford: John Lilly, George Peel, and Thomas Lodge. The next the divided Cambridge scholars, and who were Robert Greene, Christopher Marlowe, and Thomas Nash, so who were educated at Cambridge University. Except here, Thomas Hitt. So he did not receive any university education. So we don't have any authentic proof of Thomas Hitt. And next slide you have here Elizabethan writers. So Sir Thomas Yacht, Sir Roger Ascham, Earl of Surrey, Sir Philip Sidney, George Chapman, Samuel Daniel, Michael Drayton, William Shakespeare, and Ben Jonson. So they are the prominent writers, so Elizabethan writers. And the next slide, the continuation of Elizabethan writers are Edmund Spenser, Francis Bacon, Thomas Middleton, Thomas Dekker, Ben Jonson, Thomas Haywood, and John Marston. So the Elizabethan writers, they come into the part of Elizabethan as well as Jacobean, which means James the First period. So they come into to a queen and the king, right? So keep it remember, and we shall move on the next slide. You have that is continue. of that Elizabethan. Cyril Dornier, John Webster, he is the exponent to compose the tragedies, and Robert Burton, Fletcher, Beaumont, Isaac Walton, Sir Thomas Browne, Thomas Fuller, and Jeremy Taylor. So these are all the writers are the part of Elizabethan as well as Jacobean, which means James the First. And the next slide you have for you metaphysical poets. So they are John Donne, George Herbert, Richard Crashaw, Henry Wagon, Andrew Morwell. So they are expert to use conceits. They are expert to use in their poems similes. So they became popular during the time of the period of Charles the First. Right. The next slide you have the Cavalier poets. So they supported the Charles the First, right? So they are Robert Herrick, Thomas Carew, Richard Lovelace, and John Shughling. The next slide you have Restoration Tragedy, John Brown, Elkanah Shittle, Thomas Otway, Nathaniel Lee, Nicholas Rowe. Right. Next, the Puritan age. We have that is the comedy of manners. We have the Puritan age John Milton and Restoration age John Dryden and the comedy of manners George Etheridge, William Wycherley, Thomas Shadwell, Sir John Vanbrugh, William Congreve, George Furger. So they belong to the part of the comedy of manners. They expressed the high class people right in their works. The next slide you have that is drama in Augustan age. That is Daniel Defoe and Samuel Richardson, Henry Fielding, Lawrence Sterne, and Oliver Goldsmith. So they are the prominent figure, and Horace Walpole, William Bedford, Anne Bradley, Matthew Gregory, the Augustan age. Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jonathan Swift, Joseph Addison, Richard Steele, they are exponent of the periodicals, Addison and Steele, and Dr. Johnson, Alexander Pope, Edmund Burke, and Edward Gibbon. So they are the distinguished writers during the period of Augustan age. And the most important writers here we have Dr. Johnson because he published his dictionary in 1755, and as well as we have Alexander Pope, right? The next slide you have that is pre-romantic writer. Yes, Thomas Gray and William Blake. So William Blake, Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, the most popular collections of William Blake, and Thomas Gray, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, The Progress of Poesy, and so on. We have Thomas Gray. After the publication of the work, he became famous, right? Thomas Gray, William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, George Gordon, Shelley Keats. They are the romantic poets. Next, Romantic period in prose. Charles Lamb, William Hazlitt, and Thomas De Quincey. So Charles Lamb is the expert to create ideological theory, right? And Walter Scott, Jane Austen's fiction, and Victorian age, the poet Tennyson, Robert Browning, Matthew Arnold, Gerald Manley Hopkins. He is the exponent of Curtal Sonnet, Gerald Manley Hopkins. And Victorian age in prose, John Ruskin and Matthew Arnold. And Victorian age in drama, Oscar Wilde. Of course, you know that Oscar Wilde, The Importance of Being Ernst, the most famous drama which is written by Oscar Wilde. And definitely, next we shall move on. The next slide is of pre-Raphaelite movement. Yes, Dandy Gabriel Rossetti, William Morris, Algernon Swinburne. And Victorian age in fiction, Elizabeth Gaskell, William Makepeace Thackeray, Charles Dickens, Anthony Trollope, Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte, George Eliot, Annie Bronte, and Wilkie Collins. So they are the prolificate writers and during the period of Victorian era. So they are the best writers to compose fiction, especially the George Eliot. Yes, and the next slide you have, that is 20th century poets: George Meredith, Thomas Hardy, Rudyard Kipling, W.B. Yeats, T.S. Eliot, Cecily Day Lewis, John Benjamin, W.H. Aden, Stephen Spencer, Dylan Thomas, Philip Larkin, and Ted Hughes. So they are the distinguished writers and prominent writers. They are the expert to compose war and science, many, right? And most of famous writers here are W.B. Yeats and T.S. Eliot, because T.S. Eliot became famous after the publication of Wasteland, and W.B. Yeats, the most famous two poems are Byzantium and Sailing to Byzantium, and W.H. Aden, who has the qualities of Marxism in his work. Right. The next slide you have here, Georgian poets: and A.E. Housman, W.H. Davies, Walter de la Mare, John Masefield, Lascelles Abercrombie, Edmund Charles Blunden. So they are the Georgian poets. And after Victorian period, and who George ruled in England. Okay, the next slide you have, yes, 20th century prose. So A.G. Gardiner, Hilaire Belloc, G.K. Chesterton, Robert Lind, and Gilles Lytton Strachey, D.E. Lawrence. And next slide, fiction in 20th century: Joseph Conrad, Herbert George Well, Arnold Bennett, William Somerset Maugham, E.M. Foster, P.G. Wodehouse, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, D.H. Lawrence, Aldous Huxley, George Orwell, Kingsley Amis, John Bryan, and William Holding. So they are the prominent writers, especially they contribute a lot to the fiction in 20th century. And here we have James Joyce used Interior Monologue and Stream of Consciousness, James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, and D.H. Lawrence is associated with the blood relations, and Aldous Huxley, who is regarded as a prophetic novelist, and so on. Right. The next slide you have, that is 20th century drama: George Bernard Shaw, J.M. Barrie, John Galsworthy, J.M. Singh, not Singe, that is Singh, Sean Kazi, Samuel Beckett, absurd playwright, Christopher Fry, John Asburn, his most famous novel is Look Back in Anger, Harold Pinter, and Harold Pinter, who is the expert to compose, that is what we call, yes, the absurd, right? So they are the famous writers during the period of 20th century. And most probably George Bernard Shaw, who has written more than 60 dramas in his lives. And John Glassworthy focused on, that is, middle class families and upper class families, right? So thank you so much.